Bonjour à tous. Merci.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming here in such a large number despite the heat. I'm Jean-Rémy Baudot, head of the France Info Political Bureau and president of the Association of Presidential Press. And we're going to talk about the separation of powers and ideal that's under threat. Question mark. So I maybe will start by introducing the members of this panel. Benoît Curé, economist, president of the Authority of Competition, member of the Cercle des Économistes. Thank you for being with us. Sitting next to you, Raymond Zondo, former president of the Supreme Court of South Africa. Sitting next to you, Kirill Petkov, former prime minister of Bulgaria. Jamil Maouad, former president of Ecuador. Thank you very much for all of you for coming sometimes from a long distance. And Laurent Mauriac, co-president of the Syndicate of Independent Information Press and co-founder of the media Spill. So if we start by talking about the separation of powers, we thought that Montesquieu had found the right formula between the legislative, the judicial, and enabling to avoid tyranny. We realized that a couple of centuries later, it's a bit more complicated than we thought. And this is what we'll be talking about. Benoît, the floor is yours. Thank you, Jean-Rémy. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you, especially to talk about this topic of separation of powers, which is so important today, not only in France, but a little bit over the world. And the diversity of this panel is testifies of the importance of this topic. I think the students who joined us here came here thinking the separation of powers, Montesquieu, and but we'll talk about the separation of between the executive, legislative, and the judicial power. And the good students who will think of Tocqueville also, Montesquieu and Tocqueville, because Tocqueville explained that separation of powers was not an end as such, but a guarantee against the tyranny of a majority that would occur if all the power was concentrated into the hands of the executive power. In fact, a lot of things have happened since Montesquieu. Sorry, my phone is ringing. It's Apple trying to influence my speech. Uh-oh. So a lot of things have happened. Firstly, the exercise of the executive power was diffracted vertically, because now there's the decentralization with power that was passed down to the regions, departments in France. There's also Europe in France, where part of the power is in Brussels. So there's a vertical distribution of the power, and there's also a diffraction, a horizontal diffraction, with the multiplication of independent authorities, the Bank of France, the authority of competitiveness, all kinds of regulations authorities that are independent from the central government. And the reality is also complex, because in France, it's the country of Montesquieu never accepted the separation of powers, really, as shown in the recurring debate on the independence of justice, which is a debate that still is on in France. And added to this, since Montesquieu, new powers that also weigh on the balance and the balance of powers, counterpowers, the press, the media. We'll see if it's a power or not. It's part of our discussion. Trade unions, syndicates, intermediate bodies, the economic powers that are also trying to step in. And the separation of powers is attacked. Some heads of parties criticize the judges, including when the judges apply texts that have voted. Others are making a theory of the verticality of power and the weakening of intermediate bodies. In France, the independence of regulation authorities is under fire, while the independence and the continuity of action beyond election periods. It's important to know that the U.S. on this point are ahead of us. Like always, the independent authorities that are intimidated. We saw that with the pressures of President Trump on the president of the Federal Reserve recently, and sometimes the ruled over all the executive power should be in the hands of the president. That's what they want. Last Monday, in a very important decision, the Supreme Court of the U.S., Trump against Slaughter, the Supreme Court judged that all the heads of administrative authorities could be replaced by the President of the United States, who had the authority over the whole executive sector. So it's the end of the independence of regulatory authorities in the U.S. And by doing so, the Supreme Court ruled over a decision that dated back to 1935. So you see this historical period we're in right now. And to conclude, since we are at the rencontre économique, we need to keep in mind the economic aspect of this debate, the concentration of economic activities, the emergence of powerful economic actors also weigh and add risks to democracies. There's the capture of the value by major platforms, especially in the field of online advertisement. For example, the authority of competition intervene often on this, whether on the distribution of value or on the different rights with digital platforms. And I will end with a quote of John Sherman, the American senator that invented the regulations on competition. He said, if we refuse a country to rule over a country, we can't accept that a king rule over our transport, the sales of our product, and everything we need to live. Thank you. Zonda, I'll end with the floor because Raymond Zondo, on the separation of powers. You have a lot to say on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I just want to express my appreciation to the organizers of this conference and for inviting me to be here. I want to share with you very briefly, within the 3 minutes given to me, some points about our experience in South Africa with regard to the separation of powers. In South Africa, the Constitution doesn't provide expressly for the doctrine of the separation of powers, but it's accepted that it is implied that there should be a separation of powers. Indeed, when the negotiations that led to democracy in South Africa were conducted, it was agreed by the political parties that the constitution, final constitution of our country, should be based on, among others, the principle of the separation of powers. So you have parliament, you have the executive, and you have the judiciary. But in particular, in the context of today's discussion, I want to highlight the fact that the electoral system that we have in South Africa is one where people do not vote for individuals in constituencies. People vote for a political party. And it is the political parties who then decide which individuals they will send to parliament to be lawmakers. So the people don't vote for the members of parliament, they vote for political parties. The result is that in parliament, one party could have the majority. And because the people who are put there, who are its members, are there because of the party, that party is entitled to kick them out of parliament if they are not doing what the party wants them to do. If the party wants them to vote in a certain way on a bill, if the party wants them to vote in a certain way when there is a motion of no confidence in the president because, for example, there are allegations of corruption against the president, if a member of parliament doesn't vote as instructed by the party from which they come, that member of parliament is risking being fired from parliament. And that is always a risk because it poses danger to the separation of powers, because in the end, if the majority party wants to make sure that they don't do what they are supposed to do as parliament in accordance with the separation of powers, they would be fired. And then the members of cabinet, the executive, they come from parliament. The president is a member of parliament when he gets elected, but ceases to be a member as soon as he's elected. But members of his cabinet remain members of the legislature. So many years ago, the majority party up to 2024 in South Africa had made a policy decision that in all organs of state, they must put their cadres who would be loyal to the party. And that would pose a threat when the members of parliament and members of the executive are supposed to make decisions that are in the interest of the country and not the party. And up to now, what we have had is a situation where time and again, the judiciary has been stopping parliament when it does something wrong constitutionally and reminding them their constitutional obligations as well as the executive. Later on, I can elaborate more on specific examples of how the judiciary in South Africa has kept the light on in regard to the doctrine of the separation of powers. Thank you.
Merci, merci beaucoup pour cette introduction. Je vais vous donner la parole.
Thank you for this introduction. I'll give you the floor. Kilpatrov, the floor is yours.
I also want to thank the organizers because in events like that you can hear very different viewpoints. I was very interested in hearing both of my colleagues here. Usually when we talk about separation of power, we think about democracy and internal governance. 2 months ago, I had an opportunity in one of those economic forums, and I won't mention the name, to speak with a person from the close group around Putin from the Kremlin. Usually we hear all the European points of views, we hear all the US points of views, but it's very rare that you can actually hear from inside Russia. And it was a very informal conversation. And I asked him, tell me honestly, is there specific programs that you have for Eastern Europe and Europe as a whole? And he said, of course we have. We have very strategic programs for each of the countries. And I said, what are these programs based on? And he was very honest. I was thankful for that answer. He said, we try to influence the European countries in 5 aspects, and we want to do it in parallel. And I said, what are the 5 aspects? He said, proliferation in the prosecutor's office and the courts. First, Russia actually attempts to infiltrate prosecutors' offices of different EU countries if they can. Second, security services. Try to proliferate or get some people from inside in the security services. Third, in the media. Fourth, in the academic institutions. And fifth, in the church. And he said it's very effective when we're successful to do all 5 things at the same time. So when we talk about separation of power, we should not think only about securing democracy from inside the country. We should also think it as a national security issue to protect against foreign governments and autocrats to try to influence our democracies. The more we separate these 5 points, the less effective these foreign powers will be. So this was a little bit of a different angle for separation of powers, but I think it's important as Europeans, what should we do? And that would be, after that, during my discussion, I would like to put forward some arguments. What should we do to protect these separations even more so that no malign powers are put forward and attack our democracies? Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Et merci parce que cet exemple, this example, je vous laisse remettre, est très éclairant.
Thank you. It's very enlightening, this example. I think the example is very enlightening, and I think that us in France, we could give a lot of thought on is Putin's strategy, where do they stand in France on their influence strategy on the 5 points you just raised. It was very interesting. We'll talk about this later. Jamil Mawad, you are the former president of Ecuador. I will leave the floor to you for an introductory speech. Thank you.
Very much. We can notice how diverse is the world just by hearing so many perspectives here. First, thank you for the invitation. I feel honored by that. Second, is the separation of powers at risk? My point is yes. The second question is why? And I have observed that any society in the world is trying to produce more and to distribute better. That is the purpose. And for that, they have found a game called politics. Politics is the way to respond to those two questions. Politics is the way to answer who gets what and who pays the price. And in politics, there are many different regimes, monarchies, dictatorships, and democracy is one of them. And the cornerstone in democracy is the separation of powers. So my feeling is that democracy is at risk. And if the whole is at risk, how can one of the parts not be at risk? But where are the roots of the problem? I think that we have produced in the world kind of a breathing ground with a lot of injustice. The people in the world feel that. There's unfairness around us. Second, the illegitimate political representation. They say, you do not represent me, which produces, combined with corruption, a lot of anger. Remember that democracy, according to Abraham Lincoln, the famous Gettysburg Address, is the government of the people, meaning elections, by the people, meaning rule of law, and for the people, to improve the quality of life of the population. The three legs make democracy, not just one. Elections are not enough, are necessary but not enough. The rule of law, the same. And you cannot justify a dictatorship because they improve the quality of life of the population. So what happens, if you have the breathing ground, anything can be a triggering effect. That could be a street vendor in Tunisia that started the Arab Spring, that can be increasing 30 cents in the cost of the ticket of the subway in Santiago de Chile. Whatever appears can ignite because all the elements are there. And when they appear, it is like a flooding. It is massive, it is impetuous, it is unorganized, it is unstructured, it is diffuse, etc. It has a lot of power. So what to do? We need to admit that we need to define the problem first. It is a change of time or it is a change of epoch. In the change of time, something massive produces a big problem, let's say COVID. And we are thinking about how do we do to go back to the previous normality. That's the purpose. So it is like FIFA 2026, same game, different rules, some different rules. But now I think we are facing a change of epoch. So no return is possible, no place to go back. You cannot put new wine in old skin wines. You need to imagine something different, and that is the problem and the opportunity we have in front of us. We need to imagine a different social contract. We need to produce more justice, more inclusion. It is not just about money. It's the economy is stupid, as a good friend, James Carville, said, yes, but it is the political economy stupid. It's how the society lives, and the economic part is one of them. The other part are values, morals, and people want that. So, thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. We are going to talk about this tripod you mentioned earlier. We're going to give you the floor, Laurent Mauriac, you're co-president of the Independent Press Trade Union. And I would like to question you about the separation of powers. And what about the media in all this? Well, Benoît Cœuré was thinking whether media could think of itself as a power. I would say no, because they do not have the attributes of a power. They do not have the same constraints. They're scattered. They're not unified. And so we can't consider it as a power per se. Thinking of them as a power would be risky, in my opinion, actually, because it would be tantamount to thinking of them as a system, as something that would be considered as an elite, and that would give food for populism. And I think it would be dangerous to consider them as such. So what would a media representative do here on this stage? Was I invited for bad purposes? Am I mistaken? Should I have been in another forum? Well, we're here to preserve separation of powers, and we are a guardian a safeguard of democracy to avoid conflicts of interests and driftings, and to make sure that the public debate will be of high quality, and that's important for democracy. That's the theory, of course, but then in practice, we can have a source of concern. And I'm going to talk about two concerns. I'm going to follow up on what Kirill Petkov said when he talked about the 5 realms of intervention from Russia. He talked about media, and it is indeed true, it is documented. It's not only a threat, it is a reality. Disinformation coming from Russia, coming from agencies affiliated with the Russian government is documented, and this is related to the disinformation. That's the first threat, and more widely so, the power taken by algorithms of large digital platforms, social media, AI. Why is it a threat that is so considerable? Because that actually strengthens disinformation, but also with the algorithms, it is even worse. And there's nothing more than democracy is that we cannot have facts in common on which we can forge our own opinion. And this is what is the most important threat. We need facts. I would like to talk about the influence on economy. Benoît Cœuré has talked about it. We talked about economy, but we have to talk about the control by the media. The question of control of media, especially in France, because when we look at the landscape of daily print paper, we see that it is mainly held by economic interests. What I represent, Spiel, independence is at the heart of our identity. It's very important for us. Independence, what is it? It's not to be controlled by economic interests or external interests, because otherwise we have to wonder about their ultimate agenda. They may have political wills and ambitions. They may want to have a better reputation, but down the road there's a conflict of interest, and that can be a problem with journalists, because which journalist can delve into the life of such and such business leader if they actually down the road they control the media you're working for? So there are other threats. In France, among others, there's the problem about information, about the freedom to inform. And I would like to end on a personal note. I would like to talk about something as a French citizen, because we are lucky we live in a democracy where more or less everything works well. And I think we shouldn't make a mistake about the role of media. It's not to denounce dysfunctioning, but to help citizens to understand the world and to help them achieve their role in the society. It's not to give lessons or instructions, but to help citizens to fulfill their roles. And we have to do so with humility. And we have to look for the truth at the service of citizens. Otherwise, this is where there would be driftings and a disservice to the balance of powers. Thank you. Thank you, Laurent Mauriac. You all have talked about the state of play. Now, I would like to talk about the judiciary and ask you about this. You have said it more or less. The first target when we have authoritarian drifts, this is the judiciary. I would like to go back to you, Zondo, because you have chaired the commission that documented under the Zuma president. How can the judiciary in South Africa have their upper hand again? What were the dysfunctioning aspects as well?
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I chaired the commission, the State Capture Commission, and that is very relevant to the question of separation of powers, because what happened in regard to the state capture in South Africa is that a private family of business people captured the head of state, the president. Because the president of the country was the president of the ruling party, that meant they also captured the ruling party. And because the ruling party had the majority of members in parliament, it meant that whatever the president of the party, the president of the country, did not want parliament to do, then they would use their majority in parliament to suppress any attempts to hold the president accountable. In terms of our constitution, Parliament has a constitutional obligation to hold the executive accountable and to have oversight to make sure that the executive, led by the president, does its job properly and in accordance with the constitution. And then what happens when the president, as head of the executive, has got a lot of allegations of corruption against him, and more evidence is coming up, and some people who are members of parliament want him to be held accountable, but the majority of members of parliament come from the president's party, and they will stop any attempts to hold the president accountable. And that is what has happened in our country. It happened under President Zuma, but it recently happened in 2022 as well, when there was a report by a panel of lawyers, including a chief justice, actually 2 judges and a lawyer, appointed by Parliament to investigate whether the current president of South Africa had a case to answer for impeachment. And when that report said, yes, the president had a case to answer, the majority party, which still had majority, decided to shut that down to make sure that there was no impeachment hearing held. And recently, the Constitutional Court set aside that decision of the majority and said that the Parliament must create an impeachment committee so that the president must go and answer. So it happened under Zuma, it's happening under President Ramaphosa, and under Zuma it happened quite a few times. And all the time it was the judiciary which was standing in the way of those who wanted to abuse their power in South Africa. That, in fact, when you look at the history of South Africa since 1994, you will see that I think the only reason why we still have the separation of powers is because of the courage and resilience of the judiciary of South Africa. But that is at risk at the moment, because in terms of how judges are appointed, the majority in the body that appoints judges are people who come from Parliament. So if there is a political party that is a majority there, you will find that it has a majority also in that body. And if it doesn't have a majority, it has a substantial say. But fortunately, up to now, generally speaking, the judges who have been appointed have been people of integrity, and they've been doing their job properly. So the appointment of judges is critical, but it's very important that, one, they should be people of absolute integrity who have their loyalty to the Constitution and will keep their oath of office all the time, despite any pressure, particularly because in our experience over the years, there have been a lot of political attacks on the judiciary, because the judiciary was standing on making sure that if Parliament was doing something constitutionally wrong, they would say stop it. If the executive was doing anything wrong, they would say stop it. So it plays a very critical role. So the judiciary in South Africa has really been playing quite an important role to make sure that the separation of powers is alive. Thank you.
Merci.
Demin Mawad. We know that in Latin America, several presidents have changed the constitutional rules to extend their mandates. So, without being too provocative, is separation of power a luxury that has stabilized?
Not be too provocative in Latin America. It is about power. We are talking about how do you get power, the origin, how do you exercise power, and what for you exercise power. And all the political events are about that. Now, to be... Yeah.
Yeah, vous entendez bien? Non.
Can you hear? Can you hear? Please speak closer to the mic.
Or better? That happens when I say something I know about. Well, the point is that the independence, quote unquote, means what? It's like freedom. One is the freedom from external ties. The other is the freedom for. What is the purpose of your freedom? Independence means, in real life, which kind of dependence is more acceptable for you? From whom do you want to depend? From the parliament, from the vote of the people, from the will of the president? But you cannot be just independent of everything. That doesn't exist. Now, there's the temptation to get the power to use that in your own benefit, especially for presidents or that don't have moral values. So you start politicizing the justice, which is terrible. And then when you get it, you judicialize the politics, and you start persecuting your opponents, which it can be even worse, because you destroy the basic of democracy, which is a fair and clean competition. We are living on that. And that's the role of the press. It is so important, and the role of NGOs that are always trying to get those principles to be applied every single day in a very difficult environment. That's why we support that kind of activities all the time.
Kirill Petkov.
Kirill Petkov, how does the government head, you talked about the importance of protecting earlier on. What about how can we reinforce judiciary without hampering the criminal action? In Bulgaria, there have been tensions of mayors that have been arrested during campaigns. These are important elements, and how would lawmakers and the executive power can reinforce the independence of the judiciary without hampering it?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think one thing we have kind of as a benefit to be part of the European Union, all of us, Bulgaria, France, Germany, is that we have a second layer of institutions that are above the national institutions. And the question is this second layer creating enough protection from capture of the national institutions? My argument here would be that it helps, but it's not good enough yet. And I'm a big fan of the European Union as a whole, and I think we can push it forward as an agenda. I'll tell you one institution, the European Prosecutor's Office. Now, we in Europe have a European prosecutor that can actually investigate different criminal activities in each of the member states. So far, so good. The problem is we have limited the power of the European prosecutor only to financial crimes with EU funds. And what we have missed completely is things like cross-border crimes, cross-border money laundering, cross-border influence from foreign effects. And when I was sitting in the European Council as a prime minister, this was my argument. I'm like, we already have this institution. Let's give it some teeth. Let's say the European Prosecutor's Office can investigate much wider range of crimes, and this way it will be the four-eye principle. Not only the national prosecutor will do something, but the European prosecutor can do similar thing, or even have overarching powers over the national prosecutor. Now, some people would say, but that would give too much concentration of power in Brussels. I understand that as well. But how I've seen Brussels work so far is that we have 27 member states, and each one has an opinion, and each one has a view, and we still have veto powers, and we still have all this stuff. So the structure of the European Union is such that it's very hard to concentrate on a single country's power, the overarching European institution. So my argument here is, let's use the European tools we have to protect the national capture of power in some stronger shape or form. The second institution I want to quickly mention is the European Court of Human Rights. It's a great institution. There is a problem with it, though. Usually what happens, and in our case, in Bulgaria, it did happen. For example, there is a not fully lawful pre-trial arrest. After that, it turns out to be wrong. After that, the person that was arrested will go to the European Court of Human Rights. They're going to sue the country, and they're going to get some money in the end. But this is after the fact. So I would argue that we should think about some blatant defaults in the national courts to have some kind of a fast action procedure on the extreme cases, so that this institution is not used only after the fact, but it's used as a preventative measure and as a corrective measure. I believe the power of the EU is there. We just have to make it more effective, more practical, and the fact that we're 27 member states dilutes concentration of power naturally.
Je ne sais pas si vous...
I don't know if you'll find a lot of people that will agree with you. I don't know if you'll find a lot of people who will agree with you to have a trans-border judiciary, but it's quite interesting. Let's turn towards Malaria. You talked about information control. You said it was very important. You talked about the role of media. I think, Laurent Mauriac, we have to listen to you, because you said that media shouldn't be a power, and a lot of this has prompted a lot of reactions. Is it a power, a counterpower? How do you react to this? I would rather say that we're a counterpower. It's more easy. It's easier for me to say so. But this is because it's a wrong translation of false state, like a third state, or the fourth institution, or a fourth pillar. But it's not a power. I think it's a wrong translation. And this could be risky, in my opinion, because media thought that it was a power when we said that it was a fourth power, and it is a mistake. I'm not saying that media is wrong or has no wrong, but I think we shouldn't have a drift in that, because it would put democracy in a risky situation.
Peut se protéger des menaces dont vous parliez tout à l'heure, notamment de la Russie. Alors, je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez, Kirill. Comment est-ce que...
I don't know if you can hear me, sorry. Yes. The question about how can Europe protect itself? We talked about the Russian threats, but how can Europe protect itself against all these influences, including on the question of media?
Being on the eastern flank of the European Union, Russia exercises quite a lot of tactics on its media influence in Bulgaria. And they've been very successful at times. What they have done, and it's a smart way to do it now with social media so much involved, they actually micro-segment the population. For example, you're a mother of two with a cat. So all of a sudden, a special group appears in Facebook that addresses all the mothers with cats and two children of, let's say, early age. And it looks strange. But because of AI and social media, they can micro-segment the population in 500 groups. And then they blast the fake media messages. And why is this such a powerful tool on their side? Because if you have an interest of a cat, and if you have young children, you tend to feel like you're part of a group, you're part of a community. And then maybe you won't go to CNN or BBC World or some other major news stand to check what they're feeding you. So we have, at first, the first response to many of the European countries was to do fact check and say, oh, this is fake news. But in many cases, you cannot reach all the people, and you cannot say all the time, this is fake news, this is fake news. It doesn't really help. So now I'm going to put a little bit controversial thought, that maybe we should fight 500 sites with 500 sites. let's say, what if we have, and I believe in this type of, we have in Bulgaria independent journalist groups as well, to have AI-powered regional media outlets that actually distributed correct news. But this way, not to have one BBC World site against 500 Russian sites that are trying to fight it, but to have 500 sites, for example, of each local town, with some fact checks, so they're not used as a propaganda, so they are correct messages, to fight this mass flood of information. We have to do something different. I'm not sure if that's the solution, but it has to be a different solution than just saying this is fake news, because the Russians are able to push their propaganda across, and this is my final point on this one, across Europe. I would go to Germany and I'll listen to the same fake news as I would hear it in Sofia. I'll go to France, some of them are the same, they're about traditional family versus gay marriages, crazy foods that nobody eats versus this. They use the same frames across Europe. So I'll be very interested to hear your opinion. What should be the answer of this mass flooding?
Je pense que ça peut être une partie de la solution.
It can be part of the solution because indeed there's the question of volume of quantity, which is demultiplied with AI. And we don't always see it, but we can have to face articles and news and stories that are written by AI in print media. And over the last weeks, the French people have certainly read AI written stories, and they don't know it. So we have to counter volume by volume. Yes, that can be a way. But the limit is the algorithm. Because the problem with algorithms is that they will not favor the counterattack that you want to do. If you counterattack by publishing information that is true, with real sources that are reliable, then you're on the sideline because of the algorithms. And this is why it's a weapon of massive destruction, in a way, because everything is determined by the economic model of the platforms. They will want you to stay online as long as possible, and algorithms will try to make you stay online as long as possible, and for this you have to give controversial content, emotional content, something that will prompt immediate reactions, anger, pleasure, and so on. And this is how you will stay online. And they want to trap yourself in your own opinions, because they will try to see what kind of content draws you in, and they will try to feed you with the same thing again and again. And for me, the only answer that you can have is regulation. Because today, the algorithmic media do not have the same responsibilities. They're considered as hosts, and they should not. And there should be a priority in a way that you give it. They are not liable to the same rules in terms of priority of news. Don't they want to be considered as medias, or are they considered as hosts? Is it actually an upside for them? I would like to talk about the role of press when we talked about the scandals that broke out in South Africa. Is there a tandem, a collaboration between justice and the press, with all the critiques that we can have, because maybe sometimes the media could be working for the judiciary and not be independent? What is your experience on that point?
Thank you very much. Well, in South Africa, I have not detected any particular agenda that the media might have against the judiciary. On the contrary, I think that the media has been very objective when there are issues relating to the judiciary, and actually sometimes quite sympathetic. So the judiciary hasn't really experienced any negative attitudes as such. However, what we have had in South Africa is a situation where in the past there would be sections of the media, some particular publications, for example, which appear to be driving a certain political agenda. particularly during the years of state capture in South Africa. There was the Sunday Times, which is a well-known newspaper in South Africa. For a certain number of years, there were certain journalists which were driving a certain agenda, attacking and basically attacking certain people in government and others who might not be in government, who were trying to make sure that the government worked according to the law and the constitution, who were fighting against wrong things. And they were protecting people who were involved in state capture. And what is interesting is that maybe about 3 years ago, those journalists and that publication, the Sunday Times, came out publicly and apologized. They owned up to the fact that there were certain journalists that they had employed who were doing wrong things, cooperating with wrong elements in society which were pushing the agenda of state capture. So we have that situation. And I think that whatever term we give to the media, there can be no doubt that they influence society in a very significant way. I mean, I think that in our country, for example, I think that there are certain people, politicians and maybe people in business in general, that enjoy a certain amount of support from the media generally. So that even if they've done something wrong, you will find that the media will not focus a lot on what they've done wrong, and they will focus on other people. So you find that there is no even-handedness on the part of the media. In fact, I believe that to a very large extent, the media can make or break a lot of public figures because of what they can do. Even though we have had experience in South Africa where, for example, the previous president, Zuma, who is really not a darling of the media, and I think for good reasons, but he has been able to continue and has started a new political party, and that political party has got quite some significant following, despite the fact that in the media he is not portrayed in a positive way, even though I say, based on the findings of the commission that I chaired, I say that there are good reasons why he is not portrayed positively, because there are so many wrong things he has done to the country. So, but I'm simply saying that to a very large extent, the media can make or break people, and they can influence public opinion towards a certain person and not somebody else. Thank you.
Yep. Je vous en prie, allez-y.
Go ahead, please.
We started this conversation talking about the three classical separations: executive, legislative, and judiciary. During our conversation, we have learned again the lessons that the most you analyze a problem, the better you understand it. What happened right here? We have a fourth power, the media. And I remember it took many years to accept the media as a new power in a society. But next to media, we have now the civil society that expresses itself in the streets, the big power in the world. And now we are thinking if social media is a representation or not of the civil society. And then we have another power, artificial intelligence. We have touched all of these points right here. So this is the new wine I was talking about in the first intervention. Can we put this new diverse wine in the same old bottles of the framework that we were living? I think it is not possible. It will not work. So in some countries, you have the separation of powers, which is, for we that believe in democracy, the best possible organization, because you separate the powers and you can get a better equilibrium. But in some countries, they say, no, there's no separation of powers. There's just one power. There's a separation of functions. but every single function will serve to the same one power. And that's what we have to fight against.
Il nous reste un peu plus de...
We still have a little more than 5 minutes. I'd like to go back on what you were saying, Benoit, at the beginning on the issue of independence and the independence of all the regulators. We see that the question of regulation, the independence of regulatory bodies is a key. We see that in the US now, but it's also according to the confidence, the trust people have on these issues of regulations. There are a lot of people who think that the regulator is not doing the good job, that he's not impartial, that he's not fair. Do you have an opinion on that? Are there any keys? And then I'll hand over the floor to you, Benoit, afterwards. But first, Kirill Petrov, maybe?
We have a very special head of a regulator, so
Yeah.
I want to pass him the word more on this one. One little point I want to make, so we all think about on the previous topic that I just wanted to mention. We should also think that all the platforms right now are not European. Facebook is not European, Instagram is not European, TikTok is not European. Competition always helps. So we should think as Europeans how to set up our own social media and how to encourage that. But for the regulators, I'll pass the word to my friend here on the right.
Non. Je crois que ce que...
I think that what you said, and I can only assert that, all the authorities that are invested, who have executive power, including the regulatory authorities, they must comply to what was said earlier. That is, they exercise a power, the power of the people, by the people and for the people. And so they must listen to what the citizens tell them, the population tell them. This leads me to a more general conclusion. I think there have been a lot of agreements on this panel. You know, we agreed on many topics. We share the diagnosis. We're aware of the risks. It's already part of the way. And the risks are comparable in very different countries that are Ecuador, South Africa, France, and Bulgaria. And so it's a positive point. But we must be aware that the way we see the balance of political balance changes a lot with technology and with relations of strengths, economic relations that are on the move. This has two consequences. And it wasn't the background of what we discussed. The first thing is we have to give back the floor to the people, because this political regulation system based on the separation of power has been considered as acquired, but it's no longer the case. The people have to take over this debate to be able to defend the democratic system. It's no longer a system that is taken for granted. It's endangered. And so it must be defended, and maybe on certain aspects being rethought, re-engineered. And the media have an essential role to play to explain what's happening and give the right tools to the population to act. And the second comment is, we didn't cover that enough, is technology, social networks, artificial intelligence, the system of separation of power in France, the parliament, executive, judiciary, the president of the republic, and justice. Well, it was designed at a time where all this was inside 3 square kilometers, the Rue Faubourg Saint-Honoré, of the Cité in Paris, 3 square kilometers. Everything was concentrated there. And so it was people that could see each other, meet, and that's where the balance of our democracy lies. But it's no longer the case. Today, things happen on social networks that are fragmented, are fragile, that are not national, foreign. They can be manipulated by algorithms, by foreign powers. And so the regulation of the digital space as a democratic space is the major challenge. Thank you, everybody. We're at the end of this round table. Fascinating, just great discussion. Thank you for taking this time to